Chapter 10 of 10 Nights in a Bar-room by T.S. Arthur. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Nights in a Bar-room. Night the 10th. The closing scene at the Sickle and Sheaf. On the day that succeeded the evening of this fearful tragedy, placards were to be seen all over the village, announcing a mass meeting at the Sickle and Sheaf that night. By early twilight the people commenced assembling. The bar, which had been closed all day, was now thrown open and lighted, and in this room, where so much of evil had been originated, encouraged, and consummated, a crowd of earnest-looking men was soon gathered. Among them I saw the fine person of Mr. Hargrove. Joe Morgan, or rather Mr. Morgan, was also one of the number. The latter I would scarcely have recognised had not some one near me called him by name. He was well dressed, stood erect, and though there were many deep lines on his thoughtful countenance, all traces of his former habits were gone. While I was observing him, he arose, and addressing a few words to the assemblage, nominated Mr. Hargrove as chairman of the meeting. To this a unanimous assent was given. On taking the chair, Mr. Hargrove made a brief address, something to this effect. 10 years ago, said he, his voice evincing a slight unsteadiness as he began, but growing firmer as he proceeded, there was not a happier spot in Bolton county than Cedarville. Now the marks of ruin are everywhere. 10 years ago there was a kind-hearted, industrious miller in Cedarville, liked by everyone, and as harmless as a little child. Now his bloated, disfigured body lies in that room. His death was violent, and by the hand of his own son. Mr. Hargrove's words fell slowly, distinctly, and marked by the most forcible emphasis. There was scarcely one present who did not feel a low shudder run along his nerves, as the last words were spoken in a husky whisper. 10 years ago, he proceeded, the miller had a happy wife, and 2 innocent, glad-hearted children. Now his wife, bereft of reason, is in a madhouse, and his son the occupant of a felon's cell, charged with the awful crime of parricide. Briefly he paused, while his audience stood gazing upon him with half-suspended respiration. 10 years ago, he went on, Judge Hammond was accounted the richest man in Cedarville. Yesterday he was carried a friendless pauper to the almshouse, and to-day he is the unmourned occupant of a pauper's grave. 10 years ago his wife was the proud, hopeful, loving mother of a most promising son. I need not describe what Willie Hammond was. All here knew him well. Ah, what shattered the fine intellect of that noble-minded woman? Why did her heart break? Where is she? Where is Willie Hammond? A low, half-repressed groan answered the speaker. 10 years ago, you, sir, pointing to a sad-looking old man, and calling him by name, had 2 sons, generous, promising, manly-hearted boys. What are they now? You need not answer the question. Too well is their history and your sorrow known. 10 years ago I had a son, amiable, kind, loving, but weak. Heaven knows how I sought to guard and protect him. But he fell also. The arrows of destruction darkened the very air of our once secure and happy village. And who is safe? Not mine, not yours. Shall I go on? Shall I call up and pass in review before you, one after another, all the wretched victims who have fallen in Cedarville during the last 10 years? Time does not permit. It would take hours for the enumeration. No, I will not throw additional darkness into the picture. Heaven knows it is black enough already. But what is the root of this great evil? Where lies the fearful secret? Who understands the disease? A direful pestilence is in the air. It walketh in darkness, and wasteth at noonday. It is slaying the firstborn in our houses, and the cry of anguish is swelling on every gale. Is there no remedy? "Yes, yes, there is a remedy," was the spontaneous answer from many voices. "Be it our task, then, to find and apply it this night," answered the chairman, as he took his seat. "And there is but one remedy," said Morgan, as Mr. Hargrove sat down. "The accursed traffic must cease among us. You must cut off the fountain, if you would dry up the stream. If you would save the young, the weak, and the innocent, on you God has laid the solemn duty of their protection. You must cover them from the tempter. Evil is strong, wily, fierce, and active in the pursuit of its ends. The young, the weak, and the innocent can no more resist its assaults than the lamb can resist the wolf. They are helpless, if you abandon them to the powers of evil. Men and brethren, as one who has himself been well nigh lost, as one who, daily, feels and trembles at the dangers that beset his path, I do conjure you to stay the fiery stream that is bearing every thing good and beautiful among you to destruction. Fathers, for the sake of your young children, be up now and doing. Think of Willie Hammond, Frank Slade, and a dozen more whose names I could repeat, and hesitate no longer. Let us resolve this night that from henceforth the traffic shall cease in Cedarville. Is there not a large majority of citizens in favour of such a measure? And whose rights or interests can be affected by such a restriction? Who, in fact, has any right to sow disease and death in our community? The liberty, under sufferance to do so, wrongs the individual who uses it, as well as those who become his victims. Do you want proof of this? Look at Simon Slade, the happy, kind-hearted miller, and at Simon Slade, the tavern-keeper. Was he benefited by the liberty to work harm to his neighbour? No, no. In heaven's name, then, let the traffic cease. To this end I offer these resolutions. Be it resolved by the inhabitants of Cedarville that from this day henceforth no more intoxicating drink shall be sold within the limits of the corporation. Resolved further, that all the liquors in the Sickle and Sheaf be forthwith destroyed, and that a fund be raised to pay the creditors of Simon Slade therefor, should they demand compensation. Resolved, that in closing up all other places where liquor is sold, regard shall be had to the right of property which the law secures to every man. Resolved, that with the consent of the legal authorities, all the liquor for sale in Cedarville be destroyed, provided the owners thereof be paid its full value out of a fund specially raised for that purpose. But for the calm yet resolute opposition of one or two men, these resolutions would have passed by acclamation. A little sober argument showed the excited company that no good end is ever secured by the adoption of wrong means. There were in Cedarville regularly constituted authorities, which alone had the power to determine public measures, or to say what business might or might not be pursued by individuals. And through these authorities they must act in an orderly way. There was some little chafing at this view of the case, but good sense and reason prevailed. Somewhat modified, the resolutions passed, and the more ultra-inclined contented themselves with carrying out the second resolution, to destroy forthwith all the liquor to be found on the premises, which was immediately done. After which the people dispersed to their homes, each with a lighter heart and better hopes for the future of their village. On the next day, as I entered the stage that was to bear me from Cedarville, I saw a man strike his sharp axe into the worn, faded, and leaning post that had for so many years borne aloft the sickle and sheaf. And, just as the driver gave word to his horses, the false emblem which had invited so many to enter the way of destruction fell crashing to the earth. End of Chapter 10 of 10 Nights in a Bar-room by T.S. Arthur. Read by Lynne Thompson.
The 10 Virgins by Anonymous. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The 10 Virgins. My kingdom I will liken to 10 virgins, who to meet The bridegroom with their lamps went forth, with welcome him to greet. Now 5 of them were counted wise, for they provision made, to fill and trim their lamps by night, the others no oil had. The bridegroom tarried very long, this they did not expect, their eyes with watch had heavy grown, they laid them down, and slept. At midnight a loud cry was heard, The bridegroom cometh, go! Ye out to meet him with your lamps, and to him honour show. The virgins rose to trim their lamps, the wise ones took their light. The foolish ones who had no oil were found in gloomy night. They said unto the virgins wise, Of your oil give us some. They answered, We have but enough, but to the city comes, and buy of oil, and trim your lamps. So while they went to buy, a voice was heard, which said aloud, The bridegroom draweth nigh. Those virgins wise, who trimmed their lamps, went forth to meet the guest, and hailed him with delight, and went with him into the feast. The foolish virgins came and knocked, admittance to obtain. The bridegroom answered them and said, Ye cannot entrance gain. I know you not, then hence depart, your coming is too late. Those only with me enter in, who for my coming wait. The coming of the Son of Man is like a thief at night. Let us be watchful that we may be children of the light. That when he cometh we may have abundant entrance given into the glorious happy feast, the feast of love in heaven. End of The 10 Virgins, by Anonymous. Read by Esther and Simonides.
Sonnet 10 from 2nd April. O my beloved, have you thought of this? By Edna St. Vincent Millay. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shakira, July 2015. Oh, my beloved, have you thought of this? How in the years to come, unscrupulous time, more cruel than death, will tear you from my kiss, and make you old, and leave me in my prime. How you and I, who scaled together yet a little while, the sweet immortal height no pilgrim may remember or forget, as sure as the world turns, some granite night shall lie awake, and know the gracious flame gone out forever on the mutual stone, and call to mind that on the day you came I was a child, and you a hero grown. And the night pass, and the strange morning break upon our anguish for each other's sake. End of Sonnet 10 from 2nd April. O my beloved, have you thought of this? By Edna St. Vincent Millay. Read by Shakira.
Guard Number 10 by Joseph A. Altscheller. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Guard Number 10 by Joseph A. Altscheller. Guard Number 10 walked back and forth before the open gate, waiting until the wagon should go out again. It was a dim gray day of February, the air full of damp chill, and a raw wind blowing. The clouds that turned the skies to the color of rusty steel told of snow or sleet somewhere. Beyond the walls the dead weeds rustled sadly as the cold wind blew upon them, and over the yellow ponds tiny waves pursued each other. Across the wastes the wind moaned. Inside the heavy stone walls of the military prison was some life, but not the life of good cheer. Coils of languid blue smoke arose from the squalid huts in which the prisoners lived. A dozen of them strolled along the rough road that ran between the huts like a street of some shambling village. Some wore the dingy gray uniforms in which they had been taken, ragged and patched, and others were wrapped in blankets from their beds. All were thin and pale. Guard number 10 did not look long at the prisoners. It was too old a sight to stir any emotion in him, a man who was not given to abstruse thought, and who had feelings only of the primitive order. His own figure was in accord with the prison, with its granite walls, dark and stained by time, with the rude huts, the bleak yard, and the wasted, hopeless men. He was short, thick-set, wrapped in an old blue overcoat, his face stained like the stone walls about him by all kinds of weather. He walked back and forth, without ceasing, always turning at the same place, and always making his steps of equal length. His blue overcoat and blue cap were the color of the steel blue sky above him. He carried his rifle across his shoulder and held the stock with a firm hand. His figure added the most somber touch to the somber scene. Guard number 10 continued to walk monotonously back and forth, and drew up the collar of his overcoat, for the wind was rising and the air grew colder. Most of the prisoners returned to their huts, and the guard would have gone on his mechanical way, had not a prisoner spoken to him in a weak voice. He ordered him back roughly, telling him that he was not allowed to approach the gate, but the man said he only wished to see the outside of a prison, a sight that had been denied to him for a year. "Just to remind me of what I used to be," he said with a weak little laugh. Guard number 10 looked at him more closely. He had noticed this prisoner before, one of the most pathetic figures in a place that was full of them. He was not a man, only a boy of 17 or 18, young enough to be guard number 10's son, slim and fair like a girl, weak from prison air, bad food, and old wounds just healed. "I saw that the gate was open," he said appealingly, "and I wanted to take a look at the country outside, just to see the grass and the woods again. It's been a long time since I saw them." "The grass is dead," said the guard roughly. "It's had a winter to kill it, and there isn't a leaf on the trees." "Do you think I care for that?" said the boy. "It's because there are no prison walls around them." He stood where he was, 20 feet from the gate, and the guard did not order him away. I could break him in two across my knee if I tried, thought guard number 10. The air from the free world outside blew through the open gate, and the boy breathed it gratefully. Guard number 10 kept his eye on him and held his rifle ready. If any prisoner dared to make a dash for freedom, he knew his duty and would do it. The boy spoke to him again and then again, but the guard was stern and did not reply. The boy looked at the man with an appeal in his face. He wished to speak of the world outside, to hear anything that was not prison talk. "Well, what do you want?" asked the guard at last, growing tired of the prisoner's reproachful gaze. I don't know," said the boy, starting at the suddenness of the question. "How is the war going?" "What is that to you?" asked the guard. "Why were you Southern boys such fools as to go into it?" "I don't know," replied the boy in his thin voice. "I don't know what the war is all about. Do you?" "No, I don't, except that you Southern fellows are wrong," replied the guard more roughly than ever. The boy did not seem to resent the reply, as if it were an issue for which he did not care. His pale face had flushed a little under the touch of the free wind that blew in at the open gate, and he opened his mouth as if he would breathe an air purer than that within prison walls. The glimpse, the breath of the free world had a charm for him which the leaden skies, the somber day, and the dreary landscape without could not dispel. Guard number 10 was impressed more than ever by the weakness of his frame and the look of homesickness in his eyes. "They say that down there in the South they have robbed the cradle and the grave to fight this war. I guess it's true about the cradle," he said. The boy smiled. He was not hurt at the remark. "I was 14 when I went into it," he said, "but there were some younger." "A mere baby," said guard number 10. "I had been in more than 10 battles before I was taken," said the boy proudly. "But I guess you've had enough," rejoined guard number 10. "Yes, I've had enough," said the boy frankly. "I'm tired of war." I've been here a year, and I'm just getting well from my wounds. I had 2 of them, one in the shoulder and one in the side." He mentioned his wounds with a little touch of pride. "They are cured, and I'm cured of war, too," he went on, smiling again. "It's the prison life that's done it, and it's the prison life that may end me too, for though the wounds are healed, I'm mightily run down." He turned his eyes again toward the open gate, and the look of homesickness in them was stronger than ever. A faint feeling stirred in the breast of guard number 10, and he began to think it was wrong for such young boys to go to war. His curiosity rose a little. "Where is your home?" he asked. "In Georgia, in the southern part of the state near the sea. Oh, it's not gray and cold and bleak like this. It's green all the year round. The sun shines warm, and the watermelons grow big and juicy. I've had some high old times there." "Guess you wish you were there now," said the guard curtly. The boy's face had flushed with enthusiasm as he spoke, but at the guard's question the flush died out. "Yes," he said sadly, "I wish I was there. It's too cold for me here. It's not the kind of country I'm used to. The prison doctor says I can't ever get all my strength so long as I stay in this place. But down in the sunshine I'd be all right in a month. I wish I could get exchanged." "No chance of that," said guard number 10. "We're not exchanging much, because we've got more men than you Rebs have, and we want to wear you out soon." Yet pity for the boy was finding a small lodgment in the crusty soul of guard number 10. "And the doctor don't think you can get well here?" he asked. "No," replied the boy. "The air of the place and the bad food are against me." "What are you going to do about it?" "I think I'll escape," said the boy, with a sad little laugh. "Some dark night, when you guards are asleep at your posts, I'll climb over that high stone wall there and skip across the fields." Guard number 10 looked at the stone wall rising far above his head, its smooth sides offering no hold for the human foot, and then at the frail figure of the boy. "I guess you won't climb over that wall in a hurry, even if we guards should go to sleep at our posts, which we never do," he said grimly. "But even if you were to get over the walls, what could you do? You are in the country of your enemies, and it's a long road to Georgia. We'll have you back here inside of 24 hours. "Oh, no, you wouldn't," said the boy, in a tone of conviction. "It's only a mile to the town, and I've some friends there, some people who used to live in the South. I could get to their house, for my clothes are not the Confederate gray, and then slip down to Georgia, if these walls were not 20 feet high and 2 feet thick." "Yes, that's the trouble," said guard number 10. "Now, if they were only 15 feet high and 1 foot thick, you might make it. But we've got to keep you, for so long as you're not with 'em, we've got a chance to beat the Rebs." He laughed a little. The boy amused him and added a bit of interest to his lonely watch. But the prisoner's delicate face flushed at the guard's sarcasm. "Where were you taken?" asked the guard, feeling somewhat sorry for his sneer. "At Chickamauga." "And you have been in 10 battles? What was your first?" "Shiloh." "Shiloh?" said the guard, with a sudden increase of interest. "Why, I was there myself." "So you've served at the front too?" said the boy. "Yes," replied guard number 10. "I served until I got a bullet in the thigh at Stone River that laid me up for 3 months. I was invalided home, and after a while sent to this duty. But about Shiloh, that was a hot fight." "Hot," said the boy. "Hot was no name for it. For a while I thought all the men in the world were there shooting at each other, and even now, just as I am about to go to sleep, I often hear the whistling of the bullets." Guard number 10 walked back and forth more slowly, and for the first time his seamy brown face showed feeling. "You're right about the bullets," he said. "All the lead that was shot off then would make a mine. You fellows caught us napping there that Sunday morning. Our generals say it wasn't so, but it was, And Lord, how you came! What a rush! You Johnny Rebs can fight well, I give you that much credit. But you got back at us the next day when your reinforcements came up, said the boy. It was our turn to be driven then. Yes, we won back the ground we had lost, said Guard Number 10 meditatively, his mind going back to the details of the great battle. But I can't forget that first morning when you rushed us. And you were there, and I was there, and now we're both here. But it isn't so strange. More than 100,000 others were there too, and some of them are bound to meet some day. What did you think when you saw us popping out of the woods and bushes that morning? Asked the boy. I didn't have time to think of anything, replied the guard. It was just a great red and brown veil of fire and smoke, with you fellows showing dimly through it, rushing down upon us, and the noise of the cannon and rifles banging away in our ears, so we couldn't hear each other speak or even shout. It was just grab our guns and fire away, every fellow fighting for himself or running, mostly running, I guess. But we got together part of our regiment in some fashion or other and tried to make a stand, though you pushed us back and kept pushing us back toward the river. Hot, boy, I should say it was hot, with rebel bullets whizzing like hail about our ears, and 40,000 rifles and 100 cannon blazing in our faces. Boy, I don't know where I'm going when I die, but if it comes to the worst, it won't be any hotter than it was that morning at Shiloh. It was the longest speech he had made in a year, but Guard Number 10 felt emotion at memory of the great battle, and as a mark of feeling shifted his gun from his left to his right shoulder. The boy's eyes sparkled for the first time. He too was aroused by the memories of Shiloh, and he waited for Guard Number 10 to continue. There was one regiment of the rebels that pushed us specially, said the guard. A Georgia regiment. I saw the name of the state on their banner, and I remember how surprised I was to see that they were mostly blue-eyed, light-haired men. I used to have an idea before the war that all you Southern fellows were dark. They seemed to have picked us out as their particular meat, and they didn't care whether it was kill or get killed, so it was one or the other. They were brave men if ever brave men lived. Gunpowder was applesauce to them. I remember their colonel, funny enough looking for a circus, 6 feet and a half tall, as thin as a rail, his long yellow hair flying back, and his uniform 5 times too big for him, flapping about him like clothes on a line. But he was the bravest of them all, always in front, waving his long arms and yelling to 'em to come on, though they were coming as fast as they could. He was thunderation ugly, but he was a man all over. The guard shook his head and laughed, pleased at the recollection. The prisoner laughed too, and there was heartiness in his tone. That beanpole was my colonel, he said, and that was my regiment. You fellows were eating your breakfast when we rushed out of the woods and burst upon you. We went right through your camp when we drove you back. I remember stopping to drink a cup of hot coffee that one of you left unspilled on the ground. It had been poured out for a Yankee, and a rebel drank it before it got cold. The two laughed together with heartiness and enjoyment. And you were there in that regiment of brave men who pushed us so hard? Said Guard Number 10 admiringly. Yes, said the boy proudly. Then we have fought with each other, you and I, hand to hand, said the guard. Yes, said the boy. And here you are, after such fighting as that, in a military prison. Yes, said the boy. And the doctor says you will die if you can't get out where you have better air and better food? Yes, said the boy sadly. And there's no chance of an exchange. The boy stood there, a thin figure under the somber sky. The guard looked intently into his eyes, and the prisoner's face grew eager when he met the look. That wagon will be here in a minute, said Guard Number 10, and I mustn't be seen talking to a prisoner. He shifted his rifle again to his left shoulder and walked to the end of his beat, deliberately turning his back to the open gate. The wind blew dismally, and the guard heard a faint, quick footstep. The wagon was approaching, and he walked back to the other end of his beat. There was no prisoner in sight. The wagon passed out, and the guard, closing and locking the gate, resumed his march, gun on shoulder. End of Guard Number 10 by Joseph A. Altsheler.
Longitude 10 Degrees by Robert Leighton. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Longitude 10 Degrees, Part 1. "'Tis our best chance," Ben said, as he dipped the quill into the captain's silver ink-pot. "Nay, 'tis our only chance." The brig was labouring heavily on the sweeping swell of the North Atlantic. From where he sat, facing the square stern windows that looked out upon the helpless vessel's wake, Ben could see the dark, pursuing rollers as they loomed up against the lighter rack of leaden clouds. All was silent, terribly silent, on board. There was no sound now of busy seamen's voices, no measured tread of patrolling feet upon the decks, nothing but the slow, monotonous creaking of the ship's oaken timbers as she lazily slid into the furrow and buoyantly rose to mount the grassy slope of the next oncoming wave. "Yes, 'tis our only chance," the boy repeated, as he drew towards him the blank leaf of paper that he had torn from the log-book. "God grant that it may be of some avail." The plaintive cry of a distant gull startled him in his loneliness. It was like the cry of one of his dead shipmates, calling upon him from another world. He glanced nervously through the open door of the captain's room, where the captain lay silent in his last sleep. Again he dipped the quill into the ink, and began to write the words that he had already prepared in his mind. "God send speedy help to His Majesty's brig Aurora, homeward bound from St. John's to Plymouth, and in dire distress. North latitude 58 degrees, west longitude 10 degrees, as near as can be made out. Benjamin Clews, 27th July, 1746. This was the message upon which he rested his firmest hopes. And when it was written and the ink was dry, he folded up the paper, wrapped it in a piece of oilskin, and enclosed the packet in a little box-like boat which he had fashioned for the purpose. On the tightly fitting lid of the box he had carved the words, "Please open," so that no one finding it should doubt that there was something precious within. It was already dusk when he carried the box from the cabin and strode forward along the brig's desolate deck. Mounting to the forecastle, he climbed up on one of the guns, and leaning over the stout bulwarks peered down into the darkening sea with its flickering phosphorescent lights. The vessel was still drifting eastward with the ocean current, as she had been drifting for many days. "It may never be found," the lad sighed, as he flung the box far out upon the waves. "And even if perchance it be picked up, nothing may come of it." He walked slowly aft again. "'Tis not for myself that I care," he mused. "I'd die like the rest of 'em. But the brig is the king's. She's in my charge, so to speak, and I must save her if I can." He glanced aloft at the close-reefed mainsail top and at the 2 storm staysails, and wished in his heart that he had the skill and strength to unfurl more canvas, and thus bring the vessel more speedily to land. Sail had been shortened in the gale of 12 days before, when there had yet been seamen alive and well enough to work the ship. But the gale had fallen to a calm, and now the few small sails that were set only served to keep the brig before the light breeze that came from the westward over the sea. Ben walked aft to the helm, luffed the Aurora up to the wind, and again lashed the tiller. Then he went below to the cook's galley, where a fire was still burning, and lighted 2 lanterns. He left one of them on the deck outside the galley door, and taking the other in his hand, strode forward and descended to the lower deck. Silently entering the petty officers' quarters, he approached one of the hammocks, the only one that was not empty, and gently rested his hand upon it. A slight movement satisfied him. "How are you now, Mr. Avison?" he inquired, holding up the lantern. The man turned and looked over the hammock's side. His face was unsightly with the eruption of the terrible disease that had decimated the Aurora's crew. "Thank ye, Ben, I'm a bit easier now," he answered, in a thin, weak voice. "What's o'clock? 'Tis after sundown, I see." "It's 5 bells in the first night watch," said Ben. "You've been asleep these 2 watches. Could you eat something, think you, quartermaster? There's a canful of soup in the galley. 'Twould do you a vast of good. I could warm it if you'd take a drop. Will you?" "Well, my lad," returned the quartermaster, "I might try to manage just a little, if you'd be so kind. But you're too weary to do cook's work now, sure. How long might it be since you had a rest?" Ben smiled a sickly smile. "Never mind me," he said. "I'm all right. I'd a watch below the day before yesterday, after the captain was past my help. Dr. Rayner forced me to have a snooze on top of his box, said he'd not forgive me unless I did. I tied a lanyard to my wrist and gave him the other end of it, so that he might haul tight and wake me if he wanted me for anything. He never did haul, though. When I awoke, he'd slipped his moorings and sailed off on the long voyage, as Tom Harkis would have said." The quartermaster drew a sharp breath and leaned over, gazing at the boy with bleared and lustreless eyes. "Dead?" he cried. "The surgeon dead?" Ben nodded. "God help us, then," said the quartermaster. "Do you say, boy, that there's only me and you left?" "That's all," answered Ben sadly. And then he added more cheerfully, "Now I'll lay aft and fetch that soup." Some few minutes later, Ben Clues returned with the flagon of warm soup, and proceeded slowly to feed his sick companion, spoonful by spoonful. Very soon the quartermaster fell back exhausted. "That's enough, boy," said he. "I can't manage no more. You'd best take what's left for yourself, and then get into your bunk. The brig's all safe for a day or 2, so long as there's no wind. But if a wind should spring up, look you, we shall be as good as a derelict, short-handed as we are, and maybe be blown back again into the roaring 40s. You may lay we shan't run aground at the rate we're going now, though. I dare say I shall be well again afore we make land. I've got over the worst of it, and I'll be able to lend a hand in a day or 2. Then we must see about giving the poor captain and the surgeon a decent burying, as befits gentlemen." He paused to take breath. "Of course, Ben, there aren't no sort of sign of land yet, eh? You kept a good lookout, I suppose?" Ben was sitting on the corner of a sea-chest, pulling off his boots. He leaned wearily back and answered with a yawn. "I can't say as I've seen any real sign," he said. "But somehow it seems to me we can't be very far off. A school of gulls flew over us this morning, and one of 'em, quite a young one, perched on the taffrail. She looked as if she'd just come off her roost." "That should be a kind of sign," agreed the quartermaster. "What did the captain say when the last reckoning was took? Did he give any word as to where we might make a landfall?" Ben drowsily answered, "Somewheres off the west of Ireland, if I remember aright." The quartermaster was silent for many moments. He was mentally calculating the chances of the Aurora reaching land in safety. "Ben," he said presently, "do you think you could put your hand on a chart and find out our bearings?" But Ben did not answer. He was sound asleep. And while he slept, the message that he had cast upon the waters went drifting eastward. It drifted for many days, but always steadily eastward, in the grip of the great Gulf Stream. And at last it was found. It was picked up by an Orkney fisherman off the west coast of Pomona Island. The slip of paper was duly passed from hand to hand, until it came into the possession of Captain Speeding, whose little frigate, the Firebrand, 28 guns, was at that time stationed in Stromness Bay for the protection of fisheries and of trade. Of course Captain Speeding would not think of quitting his comfortable quarters and sailing off on what, after all, was probably a wild goose chase. How could he tell that the message was genuine? It might well be a mere hoax, a wily ruse of one of the Scapa Flow smugglers, or even, which was quite likely, a clever trick of John Gough, the redoubtable pirate of the Pentland Firth, to get His Majesty's ship Firebrand and her bristling guns temporarily away from the islands, so that he might run in his ill-gotten cargo undisturbed. Captain Speeding had been in active search of John Gough and his freebooting crew for months past, and it was not his intention to let the rascals slip through his fingers. And yet, considering the matter from the point of view of duty, he dared not ignore the summons that had come to him from across the sea. The distressed ship was one of His Majesty's, and if the writing of the appealing letter was to be credited, succour was urgent. "Look here, Brown," cried the captain of the Firebrand, flinging the torn and sea-stained slip of paper across the wardroom table to his first lieutenant. "This thing troubles me. If there's anything in it, 'tis my bounden duty, I take it, to send relief of some sort, eh? Read it over again. Read it, and tell me if you think 'tis genuine." Mr. Brown spread out the flimsy sheet in front of him, screwed up his eyes, and read aloud, slowly and deliberately, the words inscribed upon it. "God send speedy help to His Majesty's brig Aurora, homeward bound from St. John's to Plymouth, and in dire distress. North latitude 58 degrees, west longitude 10 degrees, as near as can be made out. Benjamin Clews, 27th July, 1746. "Well?" interrogated the captain. "I'll lay my life 'tis genuine," said Mr. Brown. "I know the Aurora. I saw her in Chatham Dockyard 3 years ago. What's more, I believe my old messmate Arthur Vincent sailed with her on this same cruise. The only thing that troubles me is the writing on this thing." He tapped the paper with his fingers. "This is a youngster's hand, some swab of a ship's boy. Why didn't one of the officers write it? That's what I want to know." Captain Speeding took a turn aft along the cabin floor, with his hands clasped behind his back, and stood at the open port, meditatively looking out across the calm, sunlit bay, to where a faint film of blue peat smoke floated above the quaint old gabled houses of Stromness. Then he returned to the table, hastily took out his watch, and said decisively, "Brown, get the chart of the North Atlantic. Find the brig's position at the time when the word was sent off. Allow for her being disabled, and calculate where she may be found. I am going to dispatch Moreland in search with the cutter. The craft can't be far off, for you see this message has only been in the water 14 days. "I have already consulted the chart," remarked Mr. Brown. "I make out that the Aurora is somewhere in the neighbourhood of the St. Kilda Islands." "I have never heard of them," confessed the captain. "Are they inhabited?" "God knows," said Mr. Brown. Part 2. "D'ye hear, Ben? D'ye hear?" Ben woke up with a start and rubbed his eyes. "Did you speak, quartermaster?" "Speak? Lord bless you, lad, I've been a-speaking this half-hour past. What in thunder's all that noise? Listen. I've heard it ever since daybreak. I can't make it out nohow." Ben sat up and listened. A prolonged, half-roaring, half-musical sound filled the air from without. "It do sound queer, don't it?" he said. "I wonder what 'tis." "Best tumble up and find out," advised the quartermaster. "I'd say 'twas birds if it wasn't so loud. Birds couldn't make all that row." Ben pulled on his boots and went up to the forecastle deck. The sight and sounds that met him were such as he had never before encountered in all his 3 years' voyaging. A fresh westerly breeze was blowing, filling the vessel's few sails. The sun was rising in the east over a grey-blue sea, and between it and the brig, scarcely as it seemed a mile away, lay a group of jagged rocky islands, whose tallest point was a green-topped mountain, shining bright in the early sunlight, like an emerald set in ebony. Above the islands there whirled in ceaseless movement, even as specks in a sunbeam, thousands and thousands of clamorous sea-birds. All around the ship, and as far as the boy's amazed sight could reach, the sea was dotted with swimming puffins and kittiwakes, gannets, and fulmars. A green-backed shag was preening its feathers on the extremity of the Aurora's bowsprit. A fearless eider-duck strutted across the deck. Along the rail a school of puffins sat, like charity children in their black tippets and white bibs. But Ben Clues thought less of the sea-birds and their noisy voices than of the one great fact that land was near. He hurried below. "Land ho!" he cried, and again, "Land ho!" "Where away?" called the quartermaster in a feeble voice from his hammock. "Right under our bows," answered Ben. "An island, 3 islands I counted, and we're drifting on to them hand over hand." "Then if that be so, 'tis no place for you down here, my hearty," declared the quartermaster. "Don't think of me, but take your trick at the helm, and look arter the ship, for you're captain and crew as well till I can move. God mend me, our fate's in your hands for good or bad, and you may lay to that." "Aye, aye," returned Ben, "but there aren't no hurry just yet a bit, quartermaster. There's time and to spare for me to see you snug. 'Tarn't as if we was bowling along under full sail. Why, we aren't making above a knot an hour at best, and the nearest land's a good mile off yet." The boy lost no time, however, in making his companion comfortable. Placing a prescribed dose of medicine, a dipper of water, and a softened biscuit within the quartermaster's easy reach, he returned to the deck and took up his post at the helm, heading the brig towards the lee side of the largest island. The rate at which the Aurora was drifting was less than he had calculated, and her distance from the land was greater. Yet, slow though her progress was, the islands became more and more distinct with every half hour. At first it had seemed that there were but 3 separate islands, a high isolated rock, whose splintered outline, with its many spires and pinnacles, gave it the appearance of a great Gothic cathedral rising out of the blue sea on the larboard bow. To the southward, a smaller islet with a rounded grassy top, and between these 2 sentinels, the long stretch of the main island, with its dark precipitous sides ascending to verdant slopes. But as the brig drew nearer still, many detached stacks and smaller rocks appeared. The frowning cliffs revealed their yawning caves and caverns, and thousands of tiny specks, that at first had looked like white pebbles in the rock, resolved themselves into roosting sea-birds. Ben's alert eyes sought for an anchorage, and soon, near the western headland of the largest island, he caught a glimpse of a sandy beach and the gleaming white ribbon of a watercourse. The beach sloped down to a channel of calm sea that was sheltered behind the hill of a protecting island. The calm bay seemed to offer a likely refuge, and towards it Ben steered the brig. Another hour's slow sailing brought the little vessel into the safety of this roadstead, where she lost her headway and rode for the time secure in the swell of clear green water. Already Ben Clues had realized the impossibility of casting the heavy anchors. He was only a weak boy, and his weakness was greater than ordinary now, for he had but lately recovered from his own attack of the fell disease which had been fatal to the Aurora's crew, and which now held the quartermaster helpless in his hammock. Ben had been the first of the ship's company to be laid up by the awful visitation. It had been caught from a distressed slave ship which they had boarded off the Newfoundland banks, and each of the brig's crew had taken it in his turn. Ben's attack had been only a slight one, but his face still told its tale, and his limbs were yet weak. But if he had not strength to move the anchor, he had at least the ingenuity to devise a workable substitute, in the use of a pair of stout hawsers, which he paid out fore and aft, lashing them taut round convenient rocks, which he reached by the means of the ship's smallest boat. In the afternoon the Aurora lay so snug at her moorings that even the quartermaster, when he heard Ben's report, was forced to express satisfaction. "You've done well, boy," said he, with an approving nod. "But now that we've fetched land," he added, fixing his bleared eyes on the lad's marred face, "what do you mean for to do? Tell me that. It don't seem to me, looking at the matter all round, as you might say, that we're any better off than we was before. We've got victuals enough to last us for months, I know, but barring the cannibal savages, you can't say as we're in any wise more fortunate than that chap Robinson Crusoe. We haven't saved the Aurora yet, look you. You'd look queer if a gale was to spring up and her be smashed to pieces on them rocks you speak of, wouldn't you?" "I was thinking we might manage to get a crew together," ventured Ben, somewhat downcast. "A crew of ox and gannets, I suppose," sneered the quartermaster. "No," returned Ben, "I mean men, of course." The quartermaster had been sitting up in his hammock to listen to the boy's account of how he had brought the brig into the bay, but now he leaned back and lay watching the play of the reflected sunlight on the timbers above him. "I thought you said as how you had made out no signs of houses," he pursued. Ben admitted that he had discovered no dwelling places on the land. For all he knew, indeed, the islands might never have known human inhabitants. Certainly no fields or growing crops were visible from this west bay. "But," he added more hopefully, "I saw a dead sheep on the hillside when I rowed ashore with the bight of the hawser, and where there's sheep, do you see, there's pretty sure to be men." "I'll allow that," agreed the quartermaster, "but even if so be as you find your men, you can't force 'em to come aboard a plague ship." Ben lapsed into silence at this sane remark, but presently, as if a bright thought had struck him, he said, "Anyhow, I've a mind to make a trip in the dinghy and see if I can find some people. From what I can make out, these here islands must belong to Great Britain somehow, and if there's anyone living on them, why, they'll speak our own tongue and tell us where we are, and that's something." So when he had cooked some food and prepared a meal for himself and his companion, he set off upon his voyage of discovery. He pulled the little boat round under the tremendous cliffs of the north coast of the island, but sought in vain for a landing place or for a sign of habitation. Sea-birds were everywhere, on the ledges of the cliffs, in the long dark caverns. They filled the sunlit air, they speckled the sea, and the outlying skerries were white with them. The cries they made were mingled in a strange musical harmony that was like the pealing of a church organ. The short shrill treble of the auks and puffins, the trumpet cry of the wild swans, the mewing notes of the kittiwakes, the tenors of the divers and guillemots, and the deep bass croaking of the cormorants and ravens, united in a prolonged symphony, and through it all was the profound roar of the sea from the throats of countless caves. If Ben had been a naturalist instead of an ill-informed ship's boy, he would have recognized this as a paradise of birds, but he only thought of his sick companion on board the Aurora and of how he might find human help. He rowed along the coast for some 2 miles without discovering even so much as a yard of beach. Once he came upon a floating log of driftwood, the remnant of some bygone shipwreck. Once, too, he heard what he took to be the bleating of a sheep, but there were no signs of human inhabitants. His little voyage was useless. So he went about and returned disappointed towards the brig, resolving to make his next journey of exploration by land. As he came again into the bay where the Aurora lay at her moorings, he glanced up the little glen that led up between the hills. The land was bare of trees, a barren moor with tufts of purple heather growing among the boulders on the higher ground, and level beds of grass marking the course of a freshwater stream. On the heights he saw the figure of a man. For a moment Ben questioned within himself if it would be wise to prolong his absence from the brig and go up to the man and speak with him. But as the stranger was only a short distance away, he decided to go ashore and follow him. He brought the boat in to the beach, pulled her up a yard or two above the tide, and set off in pursuit. When he reached the spot where he had first seen him, the man had disappeared. Ben was about to turn and walk back to the boat when a movement near him on the heather attracted his eye. A dog approached him, smelt at his heels, and then scampered away. Ben followed the animal over the brow of the hill, and at this point he came within view of the farther end of the island, and a wide bay that opened out between two great rocky headlands. He stood for a time contemplating the scene, almost forgetting the Aurora and her sick quartermaster. A voice at his elbow startled him. It was a woman's voice, strangely gentle and sweet. "You are a stranger here," she said. "Where have you come from?" Ben turned. At the sight of his scarred face, the woman shrank from him, and then the lad remembered the infection that was upon him. "Stand back from me," he cried. "I have been ill. It is the smallpox, as they call it, and all my shipmates are dead of it, all except one who is now aboard the brig across the hill there in the bay." He stepped back as he spoke, and put her to the windward of him, so that the infection might not reach her. "A ship!" she cried in agitation, clasping her hands. At last, and you can rescue me. You can carry me across to Scotland, and I shall no longer pine and languish on this barren, heaven-forsaken rock." The boy marvelled at her words, not understanding her meaning. He even wondered if she were in her right senses. "How do you name these islands, ma'am?" he asked, as if to test her sanity. She looked about her nervously, as though half afraid that the very birds would overhear her. "This where we are now is called Hirta," she answered. "The rock to the north is Barrera, the one to the west is Soa. They are the St. Kilda Islands, and they lie out some 80 miles west from the mainland of Scotland." As Ben listened to her voice and contemplated her delicate hands and her refined face, he knew almost by instinct that in spite of her coarse homespun clothing, she was not of the common sort, but a woman of good birth. He stood silently watching her, wondering how it happened that a gentlewoman should be in such a place. "From what land do you come?" she questioned. "You are English by your tongue." "We're from Newfoundland," explained Ben, "but our ship is English. His Majesty's brig of war, Aurora. And you, ma'am, how do it happen as a lady like you is here?" "I am a prisoner," she answered. "I am Rachel Chisley. My husband has imprisoned me here because I knew his secrets that would be the hanging of him if they were known to the king. He told people that I was dead, and they believed him. There was a public funeral, but the coffin was filled with stones, and I, who was supposed to be buried, was secretly carried off by his agents and brought over here to St. Kilda. I have been here for 5 long years, living among islanders who are little more than savages and who understand no word that I speak. No ship have I seen during all that time. But now yours has come. God has sent you, and you will rescue me." Ben hesitated for an instant, and then he said awkwardly, "It might be done, ma'am, if so be as you could get some of your savages to make up a crew and work our ship home to Plymouth. We're short-handed, d'ye see. In fact, barrin' myself and the quartermaster, what's lying ill with the smallpox, there aren't nobody aboard to trim the sails nor do anything." The marooned woman made a step towards the boy, but he waved her back. "Don't come nigh me," he cried. "'Tis dangerous." She shook her head. "I am not afraid," she said, "and I would risk any danger to get away from this horrible place." She glanced swiftly westward to where a vast cloud of sea-birds now darkened the sky. "Something has disturbed the gulls," she added. At the same moment, the report of a firearm sounded faintly from the distance. "It must be the shipwrecked seamen," explained the lady. "Their ship was broken on the crags in the storm last week, and they have been living in one of the caves. They are evil-looking men, and the islanders fear them." "That shot seemed to me to come from where the Aurora is lying," cried Ben in alarm. I'll engage 'tis the quartermaster signalling me to go back." And giving a hasty seaman's salute, he abruptly left his strange companion and ran across the moor in the direction of the brig. An unaccountable dread of some impending disaster oppressed him as he ran. From the top of the hill he saw that the Aurora was still riding safe at her moorings, but his quick eye discovered the figures of 2 men moving upon her quarter-deck. Who could they be? He made his way down to the beach. He glanced at the water's edge where he had left his boat. But the boat was gone. Part 3. "I'm not by half so ill as Ben thinks," ruminated the quartermaster as he lay in his lonely hammock, pondering over the situation during Ben's absence. "I do believe I'm fit even now to take watch and watch about with him. 'Tis hard on the lad to leave him to do all the work, and me able to lend a hand." He glanced towards the open port, through which he could see a snowy white seagull calmly floating on the green water. Then, looking down at the deck below him, he added, "Blamed if I don't get out of this and see what I can do." He sat up, dangling his trembling legs over the side of the hammock. His toes were but a dozen inches from the flooring. "I believe I can do it," he went on, and turning over, he gripped the hammock with his 2 hands and swung himself slowly and cautiously down until his feet touched the boards. His limbs were shaky, and his head seemed to swim, but stepping out, he succeeded in tottering across to the nearest bulkhead. Supporting himself by his outstretched hands, he went step by step along the gangway to the foot of the companionway. Slowly he mounted the stairs until the fresh sea air played upon his bare head. He sat on the top stair for a long time, drinking in the sweet, cool atmosphere and looking up into the blue sky and its sailing white clouds. "Seems to me I'd best step aft to the captain's room," he muttered to himself. "'Tis no place for the likes of me to enter, certainly, but being as Ben and me are in charge of the brig, why, 'tis no court-martial matter. Nay, now I come to think of it, 'tis my duty to go in." And rising with difficulty to his feet, he staggered aft and boldly but respectfully entered. The first thing that caught his eye was the captain's silver ink-pot on the table. Then it was the mingled red and blue folds of the Union Jack lying across the dead body of the captain in the inner sleeping-room. "Good boy, Ben," he said. "You haven't forgot what's due to a king's officer. You and me'll have to act the parson soon, too, if we can lay our hands on a prayer-book. Mayhap you know the words without the book. You must have heard 'em pretty often lately. But I don't know 'em, except we therefore commit his body to the deep until the sea shall give up her dead." An unexpected sound startled the quartermaster in his ruminations. It was a man's gruff voice, and it came from outside, below the brig's counter. "I don't know what you bullies think," it said, "but it looks to me as if the crew had all gone off on a holiday. Pull round to the gangway ladder, Alec, and let's get aboard of her. Crew or no crew, king's ship or merchantman, I'm going to take her, and the Jolly Roger shall fly at her gaff peak before." The quartermaster did not hear what limit of time the man allowed himself for the accomplishment of his daring proposal, but a thrill of terror ran through him as he realized what manner of men these were. "God, where is Ben?" he cried, and he looked round the cabin for some weapon with which to defend himself and the ship. The captain's pistols were in their rack. With what speed his bodily weakness allowed him, he went to them and took a pair of them down. They were already loaded. "It's one sick man against a boatload of pirates," he said. "But God helping me, they shall not take the ship while I'm alive." As he passed to the door, he caught sight of the reflection of his own face in the captain's mirror, and started back appalled. But the remembrance of the scourge that had killed off the Aurora's company leapt to his mind. "We got at least one strong ally, me and the king," he cried, as he staggered out to the doorway under the poop. He stood there steadying himself, with one foot on the companion ladder, not venturing to go nearer to the open gangway, where already he could hear the talk of the strangers on the ladder as they climbed up from their boat. The quartermaster listened intently, trembling the while. "Tumble up," cried the one in authority. "Make for the quarter-deck." A man sprang in upon the deck, a tall, evil-looking man, with a bushy black beard and bedraggled clothing, a naked cutlass in his hand. He was followed by 3 others and then a 5th. The 5th man was young and handsome, and his blue coat was adorned with tarnished gold braid. The 5 of them advanced towards the poop. The quartermaster levelled his pistol at their bodies. "Stand back," he commanded. "Who are you, and what is your business on this ship? 'Tis King George's ship, look you, and—" "Shut your ugly face," cried the tall black-bearded man with an oath. The quartermaster fired his 2 pistols, and the man fell. His 4 companions hesitated, staring at the quartermaster's disease-scarred countenance. None of them carried firearms, or if they did so, they were without ammunition. Their leader, the youngest of the band, stepped forward, sword in hand. The quartermaster, already exhausted, retreated into the cabin, banging to and bolting the door. The pirates, for such he was now assured that they were, went up to the poop deck, and from this point of vantage surveyed the ship. "You're right, Goff," said one of them, addressing the leader. "The craft's got no crew, none at least except that strawberry-faced lubber that has shot poor Tom." "It seems so, Alec," returned Goff, "but some of 'em must have gone ashore in the boat. They'll have gone across to St. Kilda village. One of you had better pull ashore to the cave and bring off our men while there's time. Phillips, go you. But you might take a bigger boat than the one we found. There's plenty of them, see? Lend a hand there, Flett, and you, Dewson, and launch that starboard boat. Gad," he continued, speaking to the man named Alec, "she's a real goddess, this Aurora. Not very clean about the decks, 'tis true, but well found in a double sense, eh? I wonder how she came in here. She don't seem to have suffered much in the gale that was so fatal to our poor ship. But 'tis a mystery how she came to be so short-handed. Why, they've not even anchored her." He strode towards the men who were launching the boat, and gave them some directions, while Alec stepped to the skylight, and leaning over it, peered down into the cabin, where the quartermaster had temporarily entrenched himself. It was at this moment that Ben Clews came down to the beach, and discovered that the brig's boat had disappeared. From behind the rock, near which he had left it, he looked over at the Aurora in terrified amazement. Who were these men that were aboard of her? And what was the meaning of the shot that he had heard? Surely there was something wrong. He blamed himself now for having left the brig. While he watched, he saw a boat put out from her, with one man at the oars, and his heart leaped with hope at the thought that it was coming shoreward for himself. He waved his hand, but the rower did not see or disregarded his signal, and pulled with steady, measured stroke through the Sound in the direction of the western headland of the bay, soon to be lost to sight beyond the cliffs where the homing sea-birds screamed. Ben noted the drift of the current, and calculated the distance that divided him from the brig. The vessel's wide, square stern was towards him, and from over her taffrail the stout hawser was stretched to the isolated rock round which he had bound it. The bight of the rope dipped into the water, making a rippled track as the brig rose and fell on the ocean swell. The rock was but a dozen yards away from him, separated from him by a deep channel of calm sea. Ben was not a great swimmer, but he thought he could cross those dozen yards, and reaching the rock, he would then be able to gain the ship, dragging himself hand over hand along the hawser. He pulled off his heavy sea boots and left them on the shingle, waded breast-deep into the sea, and throwing himself forward, struck out. The current was sweeping strong, but he had allowed for its carrying him out of the straight course. After a tough struggle, he came within a few feet of the rock. The tide was taking him past it, but he grabbed at a tangle of seaweed, caught it, and dragged himself into safety. He rested for many minutes on the rock, shivering. Then he climbed up to the hawser, and prepared for the final battle. With hands and legs at work, he slipped down the incline of the rope until his body was again in the water. Hand over hand, he pulled himself along. The upward ascent was more difficult, for his limbs were already tired and sore. Very soon he found that the task of swarming up to the brig's rail was impossible. Besides, he was not sure that the strange men were not still on the quarter-deck. So he dropped once again into the sea, and swam round to the Aurora's larboard side, where the small boat was dragging at her painter at the foot of the gangway ladder. Exhausted and breathing heavily, he at last caught at the rung of the ladder and climbed up a few steps. When he had rested and recovered his free breathing, he mounted further, and peeped in through the open gangway. No one was in sight. Yet what was that lying on the main deck? He shuddered as his eyes rested on the prostrate form of the huge black-bearded man, and the wet crimson stain that lay about it and converged in two thin lines that ended at the scupper. At sight of the dead man, the boy drew back in horror. Murder had been committed, and he had not the courage to enter upon the deck. As he turned to go down the ladder a few steps, he looked towards the shore and saw the woman, Rachel Chisley, standing there at the water's edge, waving her hand in signal to the ship. Ben descended and stepped quietly into the boat. No one in the brig saw him as he rowed away to where the woman waited. "Take me with you," she implored, as the boat's keel grounded on the shingle. "In mercy, take me away in your ship." Ben bade her get into the dinghy, and she obeyed. He felt that with a human companion to encourage him, he could now go on board the brig with all his lost boldness. Neither spoke as the little craft was pulled back to the vessel's side. When he had secured the boat, he got out and climbed the ladder, signing the woman to follow. He crept on board, rose to his feet, and sped forward and down the stairs to the lower deck. At the foot of the stairs he paused until Rachel Chisley joined him, and there he pointed towards the open door of a tiny dark cabin, telling her to enter and remain in there until he should see that all was safe on board. His heart seemed to cease its beating when, on going into the compartment where he had left the quartermaster, he discovered that the sick man's hammock was empty. What had happened? What was to be done? He saw a cup of rum and water that the quartermaster had left untouched in the forenoon on the top of a chest. He drank some, and it revived him. Leaving the cabin, he made his way through a dark passage along the lower deck to the gunner's storeroom, and there he provided himself with a cutlass, a brace of small pistols, and a full powder flask and a handful of shot. He carefully charged the pistols, and when he was thus armed, he returned to the main deck and stole aft to the poop. The door of the captain's quarters was open now, and the splintered lock told of its own tale. Voices came from within. Ben listened, crouching down on his hands and knees. "You'd best come out of there, Mr. Strawberry-Face," Goff was saying, "unless you want us to break in the door and drag you out. We'll not harm you. Come out and have a drink with us. 'Tis charming brandy, this." There was a clink of glasses. "Come," he added persuasively, "join us in a glass and tell us your yarn. We can get nothing from this silent shipmate of yours in the bunk here." Ben knew that the man was referring to the dead surgeon. "'Twas the king's ship, you say? You may well say 'was,' for 'tis his no longer, but mine. Mine, and I mean to set sail and be off on a glorious cruise so soon as my men come aboard. We'll run up the Jolly Roger and scour the seas and send Jimmy speeding in his firebrands to the bottom of the Pentland Firth to play with the mermaids, won't we, Alec?" "That we will," gurgled Alec into the mouth of his glass of brandy. "And Strawberry-Face shall be our master gunner and share in the swag with the rest of us." The quartermaster's voice came faintly from within the captain's sleeping room. "I'll see you all hanged first," he growled with a fierce seaman's oath. Wait till my mates come aboard. They'll let you know what it means to trespass on a king's ship." "Mates?" cried Goff with a short laugh. "There can't be many of 'em if they all went ashore in that cockle-shell we found on the beach." Ben knew now what these men were, knew, too, that the quartermaster was still alive and game. He crept out from his place of concealment, stole up to the quarter-deck, climbed over the rail, and with the help of a rope lowered himself down to the porthole of the room in which the quartermaster had ensconced himself. The porthole was open. He saw the quartermaster sitting on the edge of the dead captain's bunk with a pistol gripped in each hand. "I'm here, quartermaster," whispered Ben. "Come to the porthole." "Thank God," cried the quartermaster. And without preface or questioning, he added in a whisper, "You see what these rats of pirates are up to. They're in possession, as you might say, and there's more of 'em coming. But we've got to save the brig, Ben, come what may. Listen, have you got your pistols?" Ben nodded. "Right. Well, crawl round to the poop door. Stay there till you hear me cough. Then run in and let fly at 'em. Pick your men and be smart. I'll do the same. When we've killed 'em, the 4 of 'em, one of the carronades'll help us to keep the others from boarding us, do you see?" "I understand," returned Ben, and he moved quietly away to obey his instructions. Many minutes passed before he heard the quartermaster's signal. From where he crouched in the shadow of the passage, he saw the inner door of the captain's bedroom flung open. A moment afterwards 4 shots were fired, and 3 of the pirates fell. The 4th, Goff himself, had seen the quartermaster's uplifted pistols. One was levelled at himself. With the quickness of thought he snatched his dagger from its sheath and dexterously hurled it across the room. The flashing weapon turned in its flight, and the point plunged into the quartermaster's bared throat. The pistol shot intended for Goff buried itself in a crossbeam of the cabin ceiling. Ben Clues and the pirate leader were now alone together. Ben gripped his cutlass and rushed forward in a desperate charge. But tripping over the body of one of the 2 men he himself had shot dead, he gave a false thrust. His cutlass was snatched from his grip by the pirate's left hand, while at the same instant a full brandy bottle, wielded as a bludgeon, came down upon his head with a blow that stunned him. Part 4. When Ben returned to consciousness, he still lay upon the cabin floor. The blood from cuts made by broken glass was dry upon his face. He heard the thud of waves against the brig's quarter. The vessel was heeling over, pitching as she sailed under a fresh breeze upon the open sea. From the deck above him came the sound of feet, the splash of water, and the scrubbing of holystones. A shaft of sunlight came in through the stern windows, shedding light about the cabin. The door of the captain's inner room was open. The Union Jack coverlet was gone, and the bed was vacant. The surgeon's body, and the bodies of the dead quartermaster and the 3 pirates had also been removed. On the table a white cloth was laid, and upon it were the remains of a meal. It was evident that the pirates were making themselves thoroughly at home, and that they had taken possession of the brig in good earnest. Ben looked anxiously at the great iron-bound chest, in which, as he knew, there had been enclosed certain state documents of greatest importance to the government. The iron bands and hinges had been tampered with, but they had withstood the assault, and the chest and its precious contents were still safe. Someone entered the cabin. It was John Goff. He had apparently been helping himself to the captain's wardrobe, for he was now attired in the full naval costume of the time. "So ho, my lad," said he, seeing that Ben had recovered. "You have come back to your senses, eh? That's good. Now you can tell me all about this ship. Where was she bound for?" "Plymouth," answered Ben, "from St. John's, Newfoundland." And then, in response to further questioning, the boy told the whole history of the voyage, omitting only such facts as he deemed too sacred to betray. and when he had come to the end of the story, the pirate thanked him, said that he was a good lad, and that he should now be rated as a junior quarter-deck officer. Ben did not demur to this, but while seeming to agree to the proposal, resolved in his mind still to do what lay in his power to retake the brig and bring her into an English port. And for the days that followed he performed such duties as were expected of him, always remembering that he was a servant of the king, and that the safety of the Aurora now depended solely upon his own life and his own integrity. As soon as he was at liberty to move unsuspected about the ship, he made his way to the little cabin where he had left Rachel Cheesley. She had not yet been discovered by Goffe or his men. Ben conducted her to a yet safer hiding-place in the ship, where she could remain secure from the pirates, and every morning the lad secretly brought her food and attended to her wants. On one occasion, when he was with her, she told him more of her history, and he learned that Rachel Cheesley was but the name of her girlhood, and that her title now was Lady Grange. Her husband was a notorious Jacobite, and it was because she had threatened to betray an evil plot which he was hatching that he had cruelly marooned her on the sea-girt rock of St. Kilda. This knowledge made Ben glad that he had chanced thus far to be of service to her, and for her sake, as well as for the sake of preserving the precious state documents that were in the cabin, he prayed that he might be able at last to save the ship. He learned by degrees that it was Goffe's intention to keep the brig beating about in the open sea until his crew of 11 men should have time so to disguise the vessel, by altering her rig and painting out her white stripe, that no one might recognize her again. This plan was helped by the fact that the brig was amply provisioned and was in good seaworthy trim. But the work progressed slowly, and 10 days had gone by before Goffe deemed it expedient to make a direct course and steer for the Orkneys. Ben had been watching the crew day by day, little doubting that sooner or later the plague, of which so many of his messmates had died, would again assert itself. Already he observed that some of the men were beginning to move languidly and to look haggard and sick. On the 12th day one of them took to his hammock. In the evening of the same day 2 others fell ill. Bold and careless of danger though these pirates were, when it was a question of waylaying a merchant ship or engaging in an action with a vessel of war, they were one and all panic-stricken in contemplation of smallpox. On the 13th day the Aurora was again within sight of the St. Kilda Islands, giving them, however, a wide berth. Late in the evening Ben was in the watch on deck, when he espied a sail on the starboard bow. He did not report it, although it was the first that he had seen for many weeks. Instead, he strolled to the flag locker, took out a white ensign, and boldly ran it up, reversed, to the gaff peak. The signal of distress was answered by the approaching vessel. Then Ben hauled down his flag, lest Goffe, coming up on deck, should see it and guess its meaning. So far, none but the man at the helm had observed this action, and he, as it chanced, was so far advanced in sickness that he minded nothing. Ben glanced into his face. "You're looking sick, Allen," said he. "Give me the tiller for a spell, and you go below." The man relinquished it willingly enough, and Ben, now alone on deck, steered the brig down upon the oncoming stranger. He had a brace of loaded pistols in his belt, prepared to fire upon Goffe if he should appear from below and interfere. When the 2 vessels drew near, Ben recognized, to his joy, that the stranger was a man-o'-war's cutter. He waited until they drew within hailing distance of each other, then suddenly put over the helm, throwing the brig's sails aback. She lost her headway, and the cutter dropped alongside. "Ahoy there!" cried the young lieutenant from her bow. "What ship are you?" Ben answered at the fullest pitch of his voice. "His Majesty's brig Aurora. For the love of God, stand by us." "The very craft we're in search of," returned Captain Speeding's messenger. "Throw us a line, and I'll come aboard you." Ben flung a coil of rope. But before he could see whether or not it had been caught, John Gough had run up on deck, furious and cursing. "You young traitor!" he cried, seeing what was going on. "What are you up to?" "I'm up to saving His Majesty's ship," coolly returned Ben, levelling his pistol at the pirate. "Stand back, John Gough, or you're a dead man." For full 10 minutes he kept the man at bay. Perhaps he could not have done so, if Gough had not been in the first stage of the sickness, and too languid to act the bully. Once, indeed, Gough made a step forward, as if with the intention of wresting the weapon from the boy's hand. Ben altered his aim a few inches and pulled the trigger. The shot entered Gough's shoulder. Ben took out his other pistol. At this juncture the cutter's lieutenant leaped upon the brig's bulwarks, and in another moment appeared on the quarter-deck. Lowering his weapon, Ben turned and saluted him. The lieutenant, however, had caught sight of the pirate and recognized him. "Gough!" he cried. "Ay, Gough," returned the pirate with meek submission. "You've got me at last, Master Firebrand. Thanks to this meddlesome swab, I suppose I must surrender. I wouldn't do so, if 'twere not that my men are all ill. This blessed craft's plague-stricken, Mr. Moreland. You'd best take care of your crew. Work the brig into Stromness or any other handy port, even into Execution Dock, if you will. I'll not interfere. I haven't the strength." How Lieutenant Moreland succeeded in taking the Aurora into Stromness without endangering the health of his men, how the brig was there disinfected, remanned, and sent home to Plymouth, need not here be told. Lady Grange found that her evil husband had died a week before the ship brought her home, and she took possession of his estates, none questioning her rights. And she proved a good friend to Ben Clues, who was recompensed for his conduct by promotion to the quarter-deck, and as midshipman, lieutenant, and finally captain, served in the King's Navy, through war and through peace, for many, many years, and always with honour. End of Longitude 10 Degrees by Robert Leighton. Read by Maria Kasper.
Dix by François de Ménard. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. La nuit est sur notre hémisphère. Elle y fait encore son tour. Pour quelle si pressante affaire te levas-tu devant le jour? Je vois ce que ton âme cache et c'est le destin qui t'arrache aux humides bras du sommeil. Tu veux, ô beauté que j'adore, montrer qu'aujourd'hui le soleil est plus matineux que l'aurore. End of 10 by François de Ménard. Read by Ezwa in Belgium in May 2015.
"10 Nights in a Barroom" by Timothy Shea Arthur. This is recorded to celebrate the 10th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 10 Nights in a Barroom by Timothy Shea Arthur. 10 years ago, business required me to pass a day at Cedarville, and I was delighted with the clean, comfortable tavern newly opened by Simon Slade, who greeted me like an old friend. While awaiting dinner, I had an opportunity of making several observations, the first of which concerned the landlord's family. Frank, his son, a boy of 12, was allowed to wait upon customers at the bar, and once I caught him draining the dregs of a drink left in a glass. His mother witnessed the act, too, and admonished him. A worried look continually on her face betrayed that she was not satisfied with her present lot. She had been far happier when her husband was a thrifty miller instead of an affable innkeeper. When I warned him of his son's danger, a broad smile lighted his good-humored face as he replied, "Nothing to fear, I can assure you. Nothing to apprehend there, sir, nothing." Simon Slade even compelled his lovely daughter, Flora, a 16-year-old girl, to tend bar occasionally, a task she little relished. Indeed, the proprietor of that flourishing tavern was more than sanguine of his venture. He claimed that the keeping of a good inn advanced the interests of the town. "Why, already, since I built and opened the Sickle and Chief, property has advanced over 20% along the whole street," said he, and backed up his statement by referring to some of the most important men in Cedarville, who encouraged him and gave him their support. Among these was Judge Hammond, the richest man in the neighborhood, and Judge Lyman, who had a few weeks before received the Democratic nomination for member of Congress. That night I studied the frequenters of the bar-room. There was young Willie Hammond, pleasant and popular, whose personal qualities were strongly attractive. But his crony, Harvey Green, was an evil-looking man, much older than the judge's son, and I saw at once that he played the role of tempter successfully. No one knew this sinister stranger's calling. Judge Lyman, a bloated man between 40 and 50 years of age, was present and talked a great deal. He praised the enterprise of Simon Slade, and prophesied that in 10 years he would be the richest man in the county. "If he gets richer, somebody will be poorer," said a shabby, broken-down inebriate. The speaker was Joe Morgan, once a partner in the milling business with Simon Slade, but now a wreck. Soon after this bitter remark he spent his last cent for a whiskey punch. Several times he interrupted general conversation, always to give vent to some sarcasm or stinging truth. The company felt relieved to see his little daughter, not more than 10 years of age, push open the door and spring toward him. "Come, father, won't you come home?" she pleaded. Morgan arose and suffered the child to lead him from the room, seeming quite passive in her hands. Harvey Green was the first to speak after the father and child vanished. "If I were in your place, landlord, I'd pitch that fellow out of the bar-room the next time he stepped through the door." His voice was cold and unfeeling. Battered Joe Morgan, however, found a defender in a man named Lyon, who took up his cause warmly. The disputants came to blows, and Harvey Green drew a long knife from a concealed sheath. Lyon, luckily, was too quick and too strong for his assailant, and felled him to the floor, where he almost choked him to death. Judge Lyman and the landlord now interfered, and the antagonists were separated. In a little while Judge Lyman drew Green aside, and the two men left the bar-room. In the door, as they were retiring, the former nodded slightly to Willie Hammond, who soon followed them, going into the sitting-room, and thence, as I could perceive, upstairs to an apartment above. "Not after much good," I heard Lyon mutter to himself. "If Judge Hammond don't look a little closer after that boy of his, he'll be sorry for it, that's all. If you could look in upon them now, you would find cards in their hands." Then Lyon informed me minutely of the cause of Joe Morgan's ruin, saying that Simon Slade was largely to blame for the unhappy man's condition. About 10 o'clock, a man past the prime of middle life entered. There was a look of concern on his florid face. He asked Mrs. Slade to find her husband, who could not look steadily at his interlocutor's face as the latter asked for his son. "He was here," said Slade. "When?" "He came in some time after dark, and stayed maybe an hour." "And he hasn't been here since?" "It's nearly 2 hours since he left the bar-room," replied the landlord. Judge Hammond seemed perplexed. There was a degree of evasion in Slade's manner that he could not help noticing. Further questioning of the wily landlord revealed nothing, and the old judge quitted the place. Simon Slade then turned to me with a forced smile, and inquired whether I wished to retire, a proposition I readily met, for I was overwearied. Cedarville did not see me again for a year. As I alighted from the stage, Landlord Slade gave me hearty welcome. There seemed to be no change in that jolly round face. "How is the Sickle and Chief coming on?" I inquired. "First rate," was the answer. In recounting events since my last visit, Slade told me that Judge Hammond had bought his old mill, which would be turned into a distillery. Simon Slade thought this would wonderfully help the grain raisers of the section. Avoiding argument, I asked after Willie Hammond, who also was reported as first rate. Frank Slade next came under my eye. He had grown considerably, but a gross sensual expression was now about his mouth. He was laughing at some low, obscene remarks made by Harvey Green. Just then Flora, the boy's really beautiful sister, passed through the room, and Green addressed her familiarly. She resented his overtures, but her brother treated the affair lightly. Ah, thought I, have the boy's pure impulses so soon died out in this fatal atmosphere? After supper I took a seat in the bar-room to watch its denizens. The custom had increased. What pained me most was to see the large number of lads and growing men who came in to lounge and drink. Among these was a lad named Edward, whose elderly father came in to take him home, and I was glad to see that the youth had enough courage to leave his sneering companions. But my attention was attracted by the angry voice of Simon Slade ordering Joe Morgan out of the place. He showed no inclination to obey. Instead, he let loose his biting contempt upon the landlord, who, half drunk himself, was angered to an uncontrollable degree. Catching up an empty glass from the counter, he hurled it with all his strength at the head of Joe Morgan. The missile just grazed one of his temples and flew by on its dangerous course. The quick, sharp cry of a child startled the air, followed by exclamations of alarm and horror from many voices. "It's Joe Morgan's child! He's killed her!" Little Mary Morgan, on her nightly errand of conducting home her besotted father, had been struck on the forehead by the flying glass. Morgan sobered instantly. Mrs. Slade bathed the deep gash until the doctor arrived. The medical man soon restored life to the inanimate body. Mrs. Morgan, terrified and anxious, came in upon the scene with a countenance like ashes. She fainted, and her husband was full of endearments. In half an hour the twain, with their child, tenderly borne in the arms of her father, went sadly homeward, leaving more than one heart heavier for their visit. Mrs. Slade's humanity, together with a look of anguish mingled with bitter reproach which she had instantly thrown upon her husband, left an indelible impression on my mind. By the next night the injured child was in a high fever, which brought delirium in its wake. She kept imploring her father not to go out to the tavern. It seemed to be her sole concern. Though his nerves were shattered, Joe Morgan promised to remain at home. His wife, fearing an attack of his old madness, gave him strong coffee to drink, but it did not prevent hallucinations ensuing. Frightened, Mrs. Morgan ran for the doctor, who responded only to find the crazed father sleeping peacefully in the arms of little Mary. The spirit of his loving, innocent child seemed to have overcome, at least for the time, the evil influences that were getting possession even of his external senses. Oh, what a fervent "Thank God!" went up from the heart of his stricken wife. Later in the evening, marked by the above incidents, I was sitting where I could overhear and see all that happened in an adjoining room. Mrs. Slade entered. She had just come from the Morgans' house, where her aid had been a godsend. Simon Slade listened unwillingly to her account of little Mary's serious condition and the doctor's grave fears. There was a long silence. "If we were only back at the mill," said Mrs. Slade. "There now, I don't want to hear that again," quickly spoke out the landlord. "I made a slave of myself long enough." "You had at least a clear conscience," his wife answered. More altercation followed. Simon Slade finally left the room with an oath, banging the door after him. What a revelation was in that passage of words between husband and wife! Against his wishes, the wife of Simon Slade again took her way to the home of Joe Morgan the following evening. Broken-heartedly, Mrs. Morgan related the events of the previous night, how her husband had awakened to a terrible fit of mania, and how Mary had reassured him. Since that time the sick child had rapidly failed. A glance told Mrs. Slade that death had marked her for its own, and before many hours passed, the little sufferer died upon her anguished father's breast, with the happiness of hearing his resolution to reform. "You will have only mother left," she had said. "Only mother, and she cries so much when you are away." "I won't leave her, Mary, only when I go to work," said Morgan. "And I'll never go out at night any more." "Yes, you promised me that." "And I'll promise more." "What, father?" "Never to go into a tavern again." "Never?" "No, never, and I'll promise still more." Father, never to drink a drop of liquor as long as I live. Oh, Father, dear, dear Father. Those were Mary's last joyous words. During my 4th evening in the barroom of the Sickle and Chief, I heard its habitués worry Simon Slade over being tried for murder in case of Mary's death. I saw Mrs. Slade enter sadly and break the news of the child's death to her uneasy husband, and I had the pleasure of contributing to a fund raised for the bereaved parents of the dead child. Then, curious to relate, the landlord's wife earnestly besought the customers to help Joe Morgan keep his pledge, and she warned them of the dangerous path of drink that each was treading. Nearly 5 years glided away before business again called me to Cedarville. The first thing that struck me as the stage rolled on was the altered aspect of the beautiful Hammond estate, now neglected and disfigured. A marked change, too, was visible in and about the Sickle and Chief. It had grown larger, but dirtier. Simon Slade had become rotund, coarse, and red-faced, while his bleared, swimming eyes evidenced too surely a rapid progress toward the sad condition of a confirmed inebriate. From natives I learned that Frank Slade had developed into a rowdy, and was a sorrow and care to his mother and his sister Flora. That Willie Hammond was fast going to perdition, led on by the detestable Green, who was suspected of being a professional gambler. The reckless youth had squandered, or lost, $20,000 since my last visit, and his father had been compelled to sell out his distillery plant. In the evening I noticed Judge Lyman and Harvey Green hobnobbing, and the pair disappeared together. Soon after this Willie Hammond entered, asking for Judge Lyman. Matthew, the barkeeper, answered in a low tone, and, after pouring down a glass of brandy, the young man hurried out through an adjoining room. It was not long ere 2 other well-dressed young fellows quietly followed in the same direction. Without doubt, in one of the upper rooms gambling went on nightly. A shudder crept over me as I strolled out on the porch. While walking there I saw an elderly lady advance toward a house and endeavor to peer into the barroom. Ah, what a commentary upon the uses of an attractive tavern was here! My heart ached as I thought of all that unknown mother had suffered and was doomed to suffer. There was a peculiar restraint between landlord Slade and Harvey Green when they met next morning. That afternoon I learned of the distressing financial straits of Judge Hammond through the dissolute habits of his once promising boy, and during the evening young Hammond appeared in the barroom, wild and excited, inquiring for Judge Lyman. Matthew motioned with his head toward the door leading to the sitting-room. Hammond understood the sign and left the room. I sought the open air only to encounter again the same lady who had patrolled in front of the inn the night before. When I addressed her, it was apparent that the woman's mind wandered, but I gathered that she was the mother of Willie Hammond in search of her wayward son. At once deciding to find him for her, I located Green's room and rapped at the door. I knocked several times before I was answered. Green was able to shut the door in my face, when Hammond, hearing that his mother wanted him, jerked it open, and with blanching face confronted me. Through the doorway I could see, besides Green and Hammond, the landlord and Judge Lyman. Loose cards were scattered over a table. The young man swept by me with a bound. I followed at a slower pace. "Mother, oh, mother, what has brought you here?" he exclaimed, reproachfully but tenderly. "Oh, Willie, Willie," I heard her answer. "Somebody said you came here at night, and I couldn't rest. They'll murder you. I know they will." A few moments, and they were out of sight, but 2 hours afterward the prodigal returned to the room of Harvey Green. While I was in the office of a Mr. Jacobs the next day, Judge Hammond, looking wretched and weary, unexpectedly arrived. He begged our business friend to search for Willie and bring him home, as the boy had been out all night. I walked to the tavern with Mr. Jacobs, and together we mounted the stairs to the room of Harvey Green. Repeated knocking elicited no response, and we were about to give it up, when Mrs. Slade, pale and worn, learning our errand, bade us knock in a certain manner. This signal proved an open sesame, and we found ourselves in the presence of Green, young Hammond, Judge Lyman, and Slade. Cards, slips of paper, a pile of banknotes, bottles, and glasses were in evidence. As we entered, Hammond seized some strips of paper and tore them into bits. "You're a cheating scoundrel!" cried Green fiercely, at which Hammond sprang upon the livid gambler, choking him until he went purple. Green, however, was equally quick, and he drew his knife, which he plunged into his victim again and again, then fled during the excitement that followed. Judge Hammond soon appeared on the terrible scene, and it was not long ere the poor demented mother burst into the room. The idolized son died in her arms, and the shock killed her. At this double tragedy the whole town was wild with excitement, demanding retribution. "Lynch the scoundrel!" was the cry, as the populace hunted for Green, whom to my horror I discovered under my bed. "Understand," he said in a grating whisper, "that I am not to be taken alive." When argued with, he consented to allow me to notify the sheriff, whose custody would doubtless save him from the mob's fury. But that officer with his posse failed to protect the murderer, who was shot through the heart by an unseen hand. Then pandemonium took possession of the inhabitants. Men drank themselves crazy in the barroom of the Sickle and Chief. By midnight, both Judge Lyman and Simon Slade, as associates of Green, had been attacked and maimed. The former had his face shockingly beaten and cut, while the latter lost an eye in the scrimmage. Neither Frank Slade nor the barkeeper escaped uninjured. It was a terrible night. 2 years elapsed before I entered Cedarville again. Dilapidation and decay were fast taking possession of the Hammond homestead and the tavern. At the latter place things were in a filthy condition. Simon Slade looked a wreck, while his son Frank had grown stout and more vulgar than ever. The fact that Mrs. Slade was in an insane asylum seemed to affect neither of them. The terrible events of the day on which young Hammond was murdered completed the work of mental ruin begun at the time her husband had abandoned the quiet, honorable calling of a miller and become a tavern keeper. Flora, I learned, was with her mother, devoting her life to her. The dreadful death of Willie Hammond, for whom she had conceived a strong attachment, came near depriving her also of reason. Evening found me once more in the bar-room, where the coarse, vile language disgusted me. Frank Slade, the center of a noisy group, was the most profane. An old gentleman who called there for his son aroused the ridicule of the inmates and stirred up the wrath of young Slade, who would have struck the aged father had not the man named Lion interfered. Not long after this exhibition of drunken braggadocio, Frank and his father exchanged hot words and almost came to blows. I could not remain to hear the awful imprecations that father and son, in their impotent rage, called down from heaven upon each other's heads, and so I left the bar-room, glad to escape from its stifling atmosphere and revolting scenes. The following morning I witnessed a visit from the sheriff's deputy, who served an execution on Simon Slade. Judge Lyman had won a suit against the unfortunate landlord, and he intended to sell him out. Perhaps it was morbid curiosity that led my footsteps to the decaying mansion of Judge Hammond. At any rate, I went, and came across the old jurist, alone and in a pitiable semi-conscious condition in the house that was now no longer his, it having been seized by creditors. My sympathies were aroused, but I soon discovered that he had no friends. Steps were then taken to have him removed to the almshouse. 10 years ago he had been the richest man in Cedarville. Now he was a pauper. Another discovery was mine that afternoon. Joe Morgan had truly reformed, had returned to his trade of miller, and was sober, industrious, and successful. News of Slade's falling into the sheriff's hands attracted a large company to the Sickle and Sheaf in the evening, and from scraps of conversation I inferred that Frank Slade's idle, spendthrift habits had hastened the present crisis. Both father and son were drinking heavily. Suddenly Simon Slade forbade Frank to take any more liquor. "Don't meddle with me, old man," angrily retorted Frank. "You're drunk as a fool now," returned Slade, who had seized the decanter. "Let go the bottle." They fought, and finally the young man, infuriated by drink and evil passions, threw the bottle at his father's head, felling him to the floor. "Frank Slade, you have murdered your father!" Sternly were these terrible words uttered. The parricide uttered a cry of horror and tried to shoot himself, but his aim was not well taken. Half an hour later, Frank Slade was a lonely prisoner in the county jail. Does the reader need a word of comment on this fearful consummation? No, and we will offer none. The next night, a mass meeting was held at the Sickle and Sheaf, and its spokesman recapitulated the ruin wrought by the tavern in 10 years. Resolutions were offered and passed prohibiting the sale of intoxicating drink within the limits of the town corporation. All the liquor on the premises was destroyed. Then the people dispersed to their homes with lighter hearts and better hopes for the future of their village. The end of 10 Nights in a Barroom by Timothy Shea Arthur. Read by Mark Penfold.